it is worth touching on, I don't know whether you're going to come to this, that we did end up in a tangle a couple of times with the stats agencies. And to a degree that was a lot of that was quite unfair, because they approached it as if we had a classic 40-year-long data series, and were and the accusation, which was false, was that we were playing fast and loose with it. The truth was we were short of data, and the measurability of some of that data was really, really tough, as in the accuracy of the data. Not, I don't mean that in a benevolent sense, just the ability to match the data we were publishing to the truth of what was going on the ground. When we published that there were 3 cases in early February, there were probably hundreds of cases, but nobody knew. And so unmeasurability is a serious problem. And it was, and of course so that's a problem. And then on the other side, the communication out with government, the communication of risk in a world of uncertainty is one of the hardest things to do in the public sphere, right? Because tabloids understandably are looking for their story, and that's what they do, and that's their job. And so the ability to communicate is in a highly contested media environment is a real art form. And so sometimes you have to choose what to present in a certain way. I mean, it really came to a head over the forecasts. The forecasts were put out with the best of intentions. Then, if they didn't happen, the people who made the forecasts were attacked in the press. That is not fair. And often the forecast didn't. There was this sort of theme going around. Well, you forecast that 500,000 people would die in the first peak, and they didn't. But no, we brought in a lockdown. That was a forecast of what would have happened if no action had been taken. The bit that is almost impossible is to get the analytics of things that are hard to measure. I mean, during the autumn of 2020, we did run about as big a field trial of different lockdown measures as possible. In the tiers system. We didn't rerun the tiers system after the second full lockdown for good reason, because it turned out not to be as effective as we'd hoped.
That's very helpful. I think we're coming to the end of the allocated time. Were there any last reflections you had on that? Things that you think we should be taking away for the inquiry?
Well, there is quite. The questions I'd really like to answer are the things where you think that what I've said is rubbish.
Well, do we have any questions from the floor?
Yeah.
The entire principles you've started the lockdowns with, the measures with, were based effectively on an unproven, at least at that time, a totally unproven argument that asymptomatic infection was a significant factor driving transmission. And there was no evidence for that whatsoever. The only evidence was based upon one Chinese woman in Germany who was taking large amounts of ibuprofen in order to prevent her from having symptoms. Now, I'm not saying that pre-symptomatic people who were just becoming ill couldn't transmit, at least in that first phase, but there was actually no evidence backing that up. Second point, there's a couple of points, so if you don't, I'll put them all together so you can tie them up. The lockdown, you mentioned the lockdown measures and the forecasts. Neil Ferguson, because you said there wasn't 40 years of data, Neil Ferguson has been working on forecasting for decades, and the fact of the matter is, all his epidemiological forecasts have been wrong, every single one of them, and not by a factor of 1 or 2, but by a factor of 10 or 20 or 30 or 40, BSE, swine flu, bird flu, you name it, every single case, he was vastly incorrect. And the argument that there would have been 500,000 K dead had there not been a lockdown has no basis in fact. It's pure speculation. But because you can compare it with other countries around the world, and you can see, for example, in Sweden, or even North Korea now, for God's sake, or Belarus, or anywhere else, or Africa, there's no evidence whatsoever that the lockdowns made any difference, a beneficial difference to the number of deaths.
So
And there's just a citation for that. John Ioannidis, the leading epidemiologist in the world, along with many other experts, were banned from being on the YouTube and Facebook, and they were slandered and denigrated, and the government ministers should be protecting free speech. I was arrested 6 times for trying to defend free speech. So why don't you defend free speech and democracy in science?
You answer.
Right. So the second point you make, sir, kind of demonstrates exactly what I was saying earlier, which is that making forecasts is hard, right? And making forecasts of what would happen if you did nothing, and then doing something, and the forecast not coming true does not disprove the forecast.
But now we know.
But hold on. I'm answering the question. Thank you. So in a way, what your question has demonstrated why it's really hard to communicate this stuff in the public domain. The second point on asymptomatic transmission is really important, and maybe I should have brought this up as a different example. There was not the formal evidence of asymptomatic transmission on a clinical trial basis, and therefore it didn't get into the formal advice to me. But we knew that there was a lot of stories of it happening.
What peer-reviewed documents proved it? What peer-reviewed documents? Well, we were locked at home for 2 years. Yeah, we got a right to ask the minister responsible.
I'll handle it, Steve. So you've had your say. This session is about how we measure these things better in future.
Well, you asked for criticism.
No. I'm afraid I'm not going to take anything further from you.
Okay.
Because you've had your say.
Okay.
You've asked your questions, 2 of them. I've just answered one, and I was halfway through answering the second when you started talking again.
The science,
No, that's enough. Thank you. You've had your questions. I'm now going to complete answering them, and then I'm going to go on to other people. Okay? Asymptomatic transmission is a classic example of that middle group of problems, right? It was really important that we found out whether there was asymptomatic transmission or not, and it didn't become a formal finding until the start of April. Yet we were worried about it happening before then, and so making decisions in the face of that uncertainty was one of the challenges with the evidence.
I'm sorry, what was the evidential paper that showed that? What was the paper that showed that? What paper showed that? He just said he was provided with the evidence in April. What paper showed it?
That, unfortunately, is all we've got time for, because we need to move on to the next stage. But Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Didn't have a paper that showed that at all. Let's go. Yeah, let's go. So what was the document that showed that asymptomatic transmission was a thing? What April document showed that?
Thanks, Matt.
You made a statement that asymptomatic transmission was proven in April. What document was that? What document was it?
Thank you.
What document was it?
Excuse me.
What document was it? Are you trying to physically stop me from moving?
I'm not. I'm just trying to talk.
Are you detaining me?
I'm just trying to
Are
talk.
you detaining me from moving the door?
Can you not push me?
You're standing in front of me, not me you.
Why are you pushing
You're
me?
standing in front of me, that's why. Get off me. One more question, Matt. Just one more question, Matt. In fact, I'm going to give you a present, yeah? I'm going to give you a present. This is John Robert Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. Perhaps you'd like to read it.
Honestly,
You don't like to read it?
no. I've been to this.
Would you like the book? Would you like to read the book to check?
Hey,
You took away
It's for you.
jobs,
A gift.
The ability to feed their families in
if you
case,
could,
It's a gift to you.
in case of the care workers.
It's a gift to you.
yeah, I've seen the book.
What have you read it?
Seen the book.
Have you read it?
Experiment.
So what was the evidence for asymptomatic transmission that you mentioned earlier on? You claimed that asymptomatic transmission was proven in April. What was the document that proved that? What was the document that proved asymptomatic transmission? What was the document that proved asymptomatic transmission? I tried to give him this
Do
book.
you believe that this natural law
What
does
was the
not apply to
document
you?
that showed that asymptomatic transmission is a significant
Does
factor?
that not apply to you?
can't answer questions. You said you want questions and you can't answer them. Sorry about that. I tried to ask Matt Hancock what the evidence for asymptomatic transmission is, and he just wouldn't provide it. So that's really what we were trying to find out. You see, he was just basically... We can't really conclude anything, about what he said, because he was just basically lying. He didn't provide any evidence for that, for asymptomatic transmission. And in fact, they said that in April they were provided with evidence, but if they provided with that evidence in April, where is it? And how did that inform future decisions? And therefore, if they didn't know about asymptomatic transmission until April, supposedly, then why did they lock the country down? Surely they should have just said, if you're ill, stay at home. So it just reveals, as soon as they're asked the question, their arguments collapse. And all you need is sycophantic goons backing them up, repeating what they say. That's all they rely upon.